Welcome to the Pro Wrestling Zone. This is episode number 8. I am Tiger Height.
I'm Peanut Gallery.
And we're going to be covering a very interesting topic today. It won't be like the debate that we did, but with Hell in a Cell still very fresh in people's minds and getting the full reviews, hearing, oh, it was the worst pay-per-view in years. I heard the worst pay-per-view ever.
Yeah, a little over-exaggerated, but I understand that sometimes the WWE does put out products.
I wouldn't say it's the worst pay-per-view ever.
But WWE, especially recently, has been known to put out product that is significantly worse than what is expected
of the biggest company in the world.
Right.
Now, the really big problem with this, I think Hell in a Cell, I mean, we really discussed it last week. I think I blacked out. But I think we discussed it because it was a victim of circumstance.
Right.
With Premier Week, the Saudi Arabia show coming up, and all of this going on, they were trying to make a splash.
Right.
And Hell in a Cell being Sunday, it's like the last show was Friday.
Right.
I feel like if SmackDown was on Tuesday, this would be a much different discussion.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing with the Fiend and the end there, that was bullshit. And I think a lot of people were pissed off about that, which makes sense.
Right. So that's kind of what we're going off of
now,
when it comes to this show.
Now, we were talking about Hell in a Cell still, and we're like, hey, what about other pay-per-views that were infamously bad?
Right.
In multiple circumstances where either the show itself just fell off the rails, a superstar was unable to compete in many of these cases, or they were just past their prime. Now, Peanut Gallery, I will start the conversation with the two pay-per-views that I chose.
Okay.
I was originally only going to talk about one of these, but I feel like this one also was there because of a lot of different things.
Right.
Let's talk about New Blood Rising,
okay,
which was a WCW event that had the infamous Judy Bagwell on a pole match. The entire show was off the rails. Goldberg refused to work because it was like storyline. He's like, I'm not going to put over the jackknife powerbomb. This is when Russo is really about the let's pull open the curtain of kayfabe and just have it boom, 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 boom. Now, there was some good stuff on this show. I'm not going to say that. Or I'm not going to say that. I thought Booker T and Jeff Jarrett's match was actually fairly good. I liked it. Lance Storm and Mike Awesome, that was actually a really good match. And that was for the United States or Canada champion. But a lot of this stuff was awful. Infamously, the mud rip off of the clothes match between Major Guns and Miss Hancock, Stacy Keibler. Oh, I mean, I got anxiety from that shit. Oh my god. I mean, this whole thing was just a mess. And I think this was a couple of months before the closing. This was August 13th of 2000.
So it was about 8 months before the closing of WCW as a company.
Yep, and it was that long where this company was just off the track. I mean, Judy Bagwell on a forklift match, because the match rules changed like 10 times over the course of the night.
Right.
So it was the inmates running the asylum.
Right.
And that's why I chose this as one of the worst. Just because of Judy Bagwell, but I'm like, oh yeah, that was the Gun Stacy Keibler match. There was a lot of shit on this.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of really, really bad stuff.
Yeah.
With that going said, this one was the one I really wanted to talk about.
A lot of people think that this was the worst pay-per-view of all time.
Heroes of Wrestling. October 10th, 1999 at Casino Magic. In the Bay of St. Louis, Mississippi, which is super weird. The controversies about this were astronomical. The color commentary, where infamously Gordon Soley was supposed to be on the show doing commentary.
Yeah.
But he was diagnosed with throat cancer, so he couldn't be on it.
Right.
There was, oh god, what was his name? Rosenblum. I can't remember his last name, but he had no idea what wrestling was. He called a drop kick the flying leg kick. It was like, what? Dude, I mean, Dutch Mantel and Captain Lou Albano, no disrespect to them, awesome, infamous, or very famous in the wrestling industry, wouldn't be in the position, but they were fucking garbage, I'm sorry.
Right.
Also, Captain Lou Albano called an arm drag a reverse slam takedown. Yeah.
Right.
But the big one was Jake the Snake Roberts. This was his lowest point of his drug and alcohol. He got there, left, got either drunk or high. They're not even sure which one.
Right.
But then came back and just... Oh, this was a relapse, too. Like, this was his relapse day. He jacked off the snake. He brought out the snake and simulated masturbation with it. He passed out in the middle of the ring. He was so drunk he could not stand, without the help of the ropes. Yokozuna, I think, was almost 700 pounds at this point, and this was his last match before he died, too. Now, there was some good stuff on it, obviously. There has to be good with bad. Too Cold Scorpio and Julio Fantastico actually had a decent match. Oh god, the Bushwhackers and the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, which is still, I think, on the top 5 for minus 5-star matches. I could be wrong about that. There was Abdullah the Butcher. They wanted this to be a family-friendly show. Let's book Abdullah the Butcher. So that was fun.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. The initial thing about this show was they wanted to make this a full-blown promotion of the ailing wrestlers to at least have some work. Good thing on paper, but a lot of the stars that they booked, heyday was like in the 70s and in the 80s. Now, if they did some people like the early 90s, okay, whatever, fine. But people way past their prime. The whole thing with Jake the Snake Roberts made this thing super infamous. I mean, it was a disaster. And also, it looked terrible, even on 1999 standards. This bankrupted the guy who put the show together, basically. It's hard to really... I would say watch it. All of these events that we're talking about, I think you should watch it.
Yeah.
It's a part of wrestling history, and I think... I mean, history... What was this saying?
Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it.
Right. And unfortunately, these are really bad moments in a lot of different ways, but we don't want a repeat of any of this shit.
Right.
We could say the same thing about Vengeance with Chris Benoit, but we didn't even know what happened until after. So I can't really count that as bad.
So I guess, in concluding your worst pay-per-views, what do you primarily look for when you look at what a bad pay-per-view entails?
Now, when I think of bad pay-per-view, I don't say, oh, the entire card is bad and blah, 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 because that's not the full scope of what a bad pay-per-view is. A bad pay-per-view to me is something that people talk about for years. It's something very similar to the Pearl Harbor attacks or 9/11. It's interesting. It's important. There's a fascination with it. Morbid, yes, but there's a fascination to it. We need to put these shows in a spotlight so future promoters understand the signs.
Right.
And avoid these things. We don't want another Jake the Snake Roberts incident. I don't even think he does. I'm glad he's healthy now. He looks great now. And in a lot of these things, it's like you see the worst of the worst in many of different ways, and you need to learn from these mistakes. And really, what the thing about Heroes of Wrestling also is, wrestling is a malleable thing. You can't go backwards.
Right.
I mean, people bitched. The people in the Carney days bitched about the Golden Era. The Golden Era bitched about the Attitude Era. It goes with how we perceive things nowadays.
Right.
That is the beauty about this sport. You can have the most athletic guys from the 80s who are still in great shape.
Right.
I'm speaking hypothetically. But it's going to be a different atmosphere. I can't
Right.
see John Cena wrestling in 2030 despite him being ripped, jacked, whatever. He's going to be in his 70s. And
Right.
we don't even know what wrestling is going to fucking look like next year. 'Cause
Right.
it could radically change. And that's why I love this, is that you can't turn back time. You can't... I think now you have to unveil a lot more than what you could back in the day
Right.
of the New Blood Rising. And that's fine, but with a professional wrestling show, which is a constant throughout the years, you need to suspend... Your goal is to suspend disbelief. You are simulating a combat sport. At its core, that is what professional wrestling is. Fluff it how you want, change it how you want from there. But when you watch a wrestling show, especially a pay-per-view, you want to see a blow-off with what they're doing. It's wrestling.
Right.
You want to see a wrestling show with
Right.
wrestlers wrestling. The weekly shows, if you have them, that's the time to build the storyline, to do the raunchy angles, to do all of that. But then you say, I'm going to see you in the ring, I'm going to see you in the ring, and we're going to fight. Because this is the culmination of all of that.
Right.
That is what pay-per-views are. And when you pull back that veil and try to jam and change and make it malleable per pay-per-view, that's when you fail.
Right.
You can't have the inmates running the asylum. Or pulling back the veil too much. You can't. It won't work. And the solutions for these, there's nothing that would have saved Heroes of Wrestling. Unless you totally took out Jake the Snake altogether, manipulated the show to where Yokozuna doesn't wrestle, and then the other matches you just kind of have to bite the bullet just a wee bit. But
Right.
it was sold out. They could have done something with it. Because WCW is...
You're talking about New Blood Rising. Sold Out was one of my pay-per-views.
Right. Well, I mean, we can still talk about that, too.
Okay.
Obviously. I think it's going to be still good for yours as well.
Right.
WCW, despite them losing millions of dollars a year at this point in time, was still a multi-million-dollar conglomerate company. They could have smoked and mirrors that shit. And they could have. If you don't have Judy Bagwell on the pole for no fucking reason... all these pole matches, some of the women's matches, you need to have quality control before you put it on pay-per-view.
Right. So, all right. So we're going to go to break. When we come back, we will discuss my pay-per-views that I chose.
Oh, yes.
And we'll go from there.
All right. So take your break, have fun, grab a drink, do whatever you need to do. All right, and we are back. So with me ranting for about 11 minutes, I'm going to let Peanut Gallery rant about his events. I have them pulled up on Wikipedia for reference. Go ahead.
All right, great. So before I get to the details of these pay-per-view events, I want to premise the points in time that these respective companies were at going into the pay-per-views and what resulted from them before we go into specifics. And we'll see if you think that it's something that's worth talking about. So these companies going into the pay-per-view were either experiments of some sort, or they were established companies who had gone through some sort of leadership rebranding. Now, if you know history in the past, there have been quite a few companies that have gone through a rebranding in ownership, and it always, and it kind of falls into their faces. Mm-hmm. Even WWF had that at one point in way early history where they had that change. So these companies had recently gone through some sort of leadership change. And so I view these pay-per-views as kind of the culmination of what went wrong. So I'm not going to talk so much about the events themselves because I think most of us here who are wrestling fans have an idea of what these events were. But what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about with these pay-per-views, what was going into it, and then what the results were going out. So what happened was, what happened is you have these problems, they build and build and build, and then they have this moment. And then after that moment, you realize that you had failed in this experiment. And then that is when the downward slide happens. And that is when the company that came in left that pay-per-view a fundamentally changed company.
This is like the rock bottom.
Right,
the
right,
first rock bottom. Yeah.
Right, like to the point to where these pay-per-views could arguably have been the demise of that company's reputation or ability to produce something.
Or a certain superstar.
Right. So let's start with something that we have touched on a little bit. I'm going to start with Sold Out 2000.
This is WCW, by the way.
Yeah, WCW Sold Out 2000. Now, this pay-per-view was predicated on the idea of actually starting to let these younger stars come into the mix.
Right.
If you have a little bit of inkling about what WCW has gone through as far as creative development goes, a lot of these older and more established stars had received a lot of freedom and flexibility to determine
And preferential treatment.
Right, preferential treatment, especially in the main event scene. So that's why you had Hulk Hogan's and the Kevin Nash's of the world winning all of these pay-per-view main events, was because they essentially wrote themselves to win. So come this point in time, there's a power struggle going on internally as far as creative goes. Vince Russo wants to put it on some of the younger guys, because he realizes that these older guys cannot, they have no ability to sell pay-per-views anymore as this stands. So they give it to Chris Benoit. They give the WCW World Heavyweight Champion to Chris Benoit, who was essentially on his way out already, and he had pretty much left, like within that week.
He was WCW champion. He showed up on Raw. Now that's really bad.
Yeah, now that's really bad. So then what happened was, if you know a little bit about what happened in the month afterwards, there was a tournament for the vacant championship. There was a lot of controversy surrounding that. And then, you had that point in time where Vince Russo just stripped every one of the WCW championships at the time. This was a couple months down the road.
Right.
But this really was the start of that crack appearing, as far as its creative direction goes. And that's what happens when you give wrestlers, there were too many cooks in the kitchen. And none of these younger guys were seeing any benefits from their rewards. And you're trying to give it to this young guy now because you want to try something new. You have this new experiment where you have this new creative direction, and it just falls apart.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I look at when I look at what the worst pay-per-view is. I'm literally looking at what pay-per-view was so bad that not only did it expose the problems of the actual company, but the reception was so bad, or the aftermath was so bad, that there was no way that they could have recovered as they were.
I honestly think WCW could have recovered. I think they could have.
They could have, but it was too late.
Right.
It was way too late for them to recover. They literally had no money, and then they just cut the cord.
Right.
Powers that be cut the cord.
Right.
So we're gonna look at a company that still does exist, and we're gonna look at it from a couple years ago, because I think it plays off really well of some of the struggles that they've gone through. We're gonna look at TNA's Victory Road 2011. Very well known for the Jeff Hardy controversy, where he showed up and he was pretty much drunk. He was like wasted. Well,
Right.
I think he was either wasted or high or some combination.
It was a very Jake the Snake Roberts moment.
Yeah,
with him, too.
pretty much.
But now the difference between the two is that TNA has been around for a while, and it was a company that was doing. I mean, at this point, it wasn't doing garbage.
It wasn't doing garbage, but what was going on, if you know a little bit about the history of TNA between 2010 and 2012, they were going through an experiment. Experiment meaning that Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff were signed on to essentially run the company.
This is probably the strongest roster that they had.
And it was the strongest roster they ever had, because when you have Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff running the show, you know that it's going to be a strong brand, and that was the intention of Dixie Carter, who was still owner of the company at the time.
Right.
She wanted to take the company to the next level, so she thought bringing high-profile consultants in like Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff would have helped the company. And you know what happened. There was a very brief Monday Night War in 2010. That kind of killed it. You know, that was the start of the problems.
If Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan stayed off of television, I think they actually could have done something fairly good with it.
Yeah, and again, that was the first of many poor decisions that were made. And so what happens after Victory Road 2011, TNA runs into a ton of money problems. Mm-hmm. They have to release a ton of people off their roster, and things like that had even caused Panda Energy, who was the majority owner at the time, to pull their stake out of the company. And this was only a few months after Victory Road 2011. That's when they started running into serious issues.
Right.
Like, serious issues. And so, again, Victory Road did not kill TNA, but it exposed the problems that they had encountered.
Right. I mean, honestly, there was some really good stuff in this show too.
In all, it wasn't a bad show of itself.
Matt Hardy and AJ Styles was a really good match, and then the X Division match where they had a young buck. Jeremy Buck is a young buck. They had the Young Bucks signed to their company.
Right.
Now, this is before they became huge, but that's also the thing. Around that time, that's when they were released. Yeah. And it's like, the trajectory of professional wrestling as it sits right now would have been drastically different if they treated the younger stars a lot better. What TNA was doing, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but what TNA was doing was they were pushing the bigger stars,
right,
and keeping back some of the younger stars.
Right, because what happened was TNA has been built on the likes of AJ Styles, of Samoa Joe, of Kazarian. All of these stars who were essentially homegrown talents.
And awesome talents, too.
What happened was Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff come in. They bring a bunch of their old WWE, WCW buddies in because they...
Ric Flair, the Nasty Boys. Right. It's like, come on.
Mr. Anderson, Jeff
I thought Mr.
Hardys.
I thought Mr. Anderson was good. And Jeff Hardy was there before.
Right, but they kept them along. They kept them along because, like, ooh, this is going to be a big company now. And so what happens is then you overinflate the roster with not so great people.
There were some people that
people who were pushing the homegrown talent down.
Right,
and
that's where they were like losing it. It's like, have the homegrown talent with like your Rob Van Dams and Jeff Hardys and blah 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 and your Stings who's still doing good work. But I mean, Kazarian was the X Division champion at the time. Beer Money were the tag team champions, 5th on the card. Which is fine. I think that's a good spot for them. And like you said, I mean, Styles obviously was like their main person, but they were just trying to do everything that WCW did, thinking that it would work again. And to be honest, it couldn't. Immortal was dominating every segment.
Right.
And it was like the power struggle thing happened once because it felt authentic. When you do it once, the next couple of times does not feel as authentic.
Right.
So,
Yeah, so, I think that Victory Road highlighted a lot of those issues, and so that's why I kind of put that on my list, was because of that emphasis.
Right.
The last one, I think a lot of us know about this pay-per-view as well.
Now, this was the rock bottom for not this promotion, but this brand.
Exactly. So we're going to talk about ECW December to Dismember 2006 edition. And everyone knows what happened literally the day after December to Dismember happened. Right. So we're going to go into detail that in a little bit, but let me preface this. WWE in the mid-2000s had a pretty successful run with a couple of one-night stand hardcore reunion pay-per-views.
Yep.
So WWE decided that they wanted to do an experiment. Call it ECW because they own the name. They brought in Paul Heyman. Rob Van Dam was the inaugural ECW champion. And ECW, from its inception up to this point, was a fundamentally different brand than Raw and SmackDown.
Yep. Which is
very fundamentally different.
It looked raunchier.
Right.
It was on Tuesday night. It
was on later. It was on and off. It wasn't like on one of the big television brands. It had a grittier setup, smaller entrance. Very.
They brought in like indie stars like CM Punk. It kind of helped Hardcore Holly go along a little bit more, who wasn't a bad wrestler.
I'm not talking about Hardcore Holly. I'm talking about ECW as a brand. So what was going on was this experiment was happening: hardcore matches, unique styles, things like that. And then Eric Bischoff wanted to do a pay-per-view. This event was
Eric Bischoff?
Not Eric Bischoff. Paul Heyman wanted to do this pay-per-view.
Which was a pay-per-view in 1995, so...
which was based off. So he was kind of moving it along and really building up a strong case for it. Now, the background, or the background to this pay-per-view, was there was going to be an Extreme Elimination Chamber match for the ECW champion. Which is fine. The concept in of itself is very gritty, that kind of thing. But that was one of only 2 matches that were announced for the entire pay-per-view leading up to the actual event itself. Does that really sound that sounds familiar, doesn't it, Tiger Heights?
It does. It absolutely does.
And the other match that was announced, the Hardys versus M&M,
it's a fine
match, but none of those stars were ECW wrestlers.
Right.
Problem number 1. Problem number 2 is there was one person in the Extreme Elimination Chamber match for the ECW champion that wasn't technically part of the ECW brand at the time. And guess what? That's the guy who won.
And also, there was a replacement. Hardcore Holly replaced Sabu.
Right.
Sabu was originally scheduled in the Extreme Elimination Chamber.
Right, and all the other matches weren't very good because there was no build. It felt like a regular. If you watch the event, it felt like a regular ECW show, which isn't good for a pay-per-view. The other thing too is that it was 1 week after. Survivor Series.
Yep.
Which was a big pay-per-view, and so a lot of the stars that could have helped this show weren't available. It was literally the week after.
Right.
And when you run into something like that, you have a fundamentally weaker show. And so that's kind of what the event resulted in.
And Big Show was the ECW champion going into it, and he was grossly overweight, even for his size.
Right.
But he was going to retire 2 or 3 months after.
Right. So what happened was this experiment. Obviously, this experiment did not go over well. It failed. I think it had one of the lowest pay-per-view buys in WWE history, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And there were only 4,800 people in attendance. So it didn't feel like a pay-per-view. It felt like a really big house show with a really big main attraction match.
Right.
Obviously, the event did not happen again. So the fallout was Paul Heyman was released, and I think I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Big Show had left as well, right, for a while.
Yeah, he left. I think it was his first retirement. I think he had some injuries. He was very overweight. He came back looking fucking awesome. Another fun fact: this was the show that canceled Tribe-branded pay-per-views for the rest of ever when ECW was there.
Right. So yeah, that was one of the results of this was after WrestleMania 23, which was that next year, every single brand became a Tribe-branded pay-per-view. And the bigger thing that happened after this pay-per-view, with the release of Paul Heyman, the experiment failed. Remember, ECW did not start out as a brand that was supposed to be integrated with WWE.
Right.
It was supposed to be something distinct. It was supposed to be something that felt like ECW originally was.
Paul Heyman stated that this incarnation of ECW, with him at the helm, he wanted this brand to be the integration for rising indie stars like CM Punk to get the training and exposure on television, like what NXT is doing, and build these guys up, and maybe bring some guys who are maybe phasing out a little bit, not wrestling as much, to be on these shows, to bring these people up to go to Raw and SmackDown. It was supposed to be NXT circa 2006.
Right. So what happened at that point was then ECW transitioned into just another brand, and it never... The experiment that Paul Heyman had failed, and WWE reverted the ECW brand to a brand co-equal with Raw and SmackDown.
Right.
Which,
this was not a default of Paul Heyman. Mr. McMahon had a different vision, and McMahon was still very involved in all three shows.
Right. So that's kind of what happened. So December to Dismember didn't kill ECW. It didn't kill ECW even as a WWE brand. In fact, it killed ECW as the experiment and created ECW, the WWE brand.
Right.
And that is my criteria for selecting some of the worst pay-per-views, is that you look at something like TNA's Victory Road, that was the start of a long downfall to where TNA rebranded itself as Impact Wrestling. Right. And so TNA as a brand doesn't even exist anymore.
No. Also, before we basically sign off at this point, we did not talk... We did not talk about the Saudi Arabia shows because we're going to cover the Saudi Arabia shows in its own episode.
Yes, we are.
Since it's a multi-year deal and there's so much like flack for it, it deserves its own little slot. So
right. And the events themselves weren't all in all bad. Like they wouldn't be considered on that list because there are a lot of other factors that make this show happen that would qualify it separately. So
right.
If you have any pay-per-views that you like or that you want, or if you have any opinions on what your worst pay-per-view was,
tweet them at us.
Yeah.
We'll be more than happy to respond.
The other thing, too, is next week's show we are going, because I know that the draft happened, and I know that we're kind of in the middle of it, so next week's show is going to be primarily focused on the draft.
Yep. The draft kind of rivalries that we're seeing, blah, blah, blah.
Right, and is there anything else that we need to discuss? Any major news this week that happened? I can't think of anything, really.
Not really that I saw. I'm seeing, I was looking on Twitter earlier, and
a lot of draft news.
Well, Beth Hardy, the wife of Jeff Hardy, has responded finally after the DWI that Jeff had.
Ah, yes.
And apparently her and Rebby are having a online fight, and it's actually kind of entertaining. Because I fucking love Rebby. She's pregnant again. This is the third son of the Hardys, and I mean that's fine. I don't care. But I thought that was kind of entertaining. I was like watching the threads for like an hour because man, they were throwing some fucking shade. It was amazing.
Nice.
I mean, that's probably the biggest thing with the DWI for Jeff Hardy. For God's sake, dude, like he has kids. He needs to like chill. He needs to like.
Don't drink and drive.
He should drink it all at this point.
God.
I mean, he just gets himself into these problems. He had a DUI not too long ago, and then he has a DWI now.
Yeah.
And did you see his mugshot? He's grinning like a fucking hen. He looks like Justin Bieber's mugshot when he was pulled over.
Nice. So, yeah, we'll cover the draft next week.
Yes, enjoy the draft, enjoy the shows, and if something big happens over the course of whatever, we'll do the shows. But if not, then we're talking about the draft. And then I think that's the week of Saudi Arabia, so we'll talk about Saudi Arabia with Crown Jewel happening on Saturday. Yes? Saturday?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, Crown Jewel happens. Well,
It's
hold
like at
on.
noon on
Well, I
Friday or something.
understand that, but that's not gonna be the week after. It's gonna be the week after the week after.
Oh, okay.
So 3 weeks from now.
Gotcha. All right.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Good night, guys.